Hello, everyone. I'm Raga Olga De Silva. Welcome to Older Queer Voices, Episode 5. Today's topic is Section 28. We were there. In this episode of Older Queer Voices, we turn our attention to Section 28, a piece of legislation that shaped the lives of LGBTQIA plus people in the UK for over 15 years. Introduced by Margaret Thatcher's government in 1988, Section 28 banned local authorities and schools from promoting homosexuality, a vague and chilling mandate that stifled support, erased representation, and instilled a culture of fear. While officially repealed in 2003, its legacy lingers in the memories, traumas, and silences of a generation. Today, we are joined by two people with deep knowledge and lived experiences of this time. They were there. Professor Sue Sanders, co-founder of Schools Out UK and LGBT plus History Month, and John Vincent, a leading voice in libraries, equality and inclusion. Together, we will explore the real impact of Section 28 on educators, parents, young people, and ask what lessons we have truly learned since then. We will also look at where we are now, with rising hostility towards trans communities and controversial interventions from institutions like the Equality and Human Rights Commission, the EHRC. Many are asking, are we seeing echoes of Section 28 today? What do we need to do urgently to resist a return to fear, invisibility, and silencing? Welcoming Professor Sue Sanders and welcome John Vincent. How are you both this very, very 32 degrees hot afternoon?
Not quite as hot in Devon.
Oh, isn't it? Lucky, I'm just moving there now.
Oh.
So how are you managing?
It's fine. I'm in Margate, and the North Sea is sending a nice breeze, so I'm thoroughly enjoying it.
Fantastic. You have to forgive me because I will be using my tissue quite often, although I have a fan right in front. I'm from India. I get heated up. So good to have you both on Older Queer Voices podcast. So I'm going to start at the start. And Sue, it's to you. What is Section 28?
Okay, so it was part of the Local Government Act 1988. And that was an act that the Tories brought in, which was an absolutely vicious attack on equality and all the work that diversity and equality and inclusion. It's not unsimilar to what Trump is doing now, trying to disenable all the equality work that was being done. So some Labour councils, some local authorities had actually attempted to think about actually delivering services to their entire population. So had begun to think about how they can make sure that when they're putting a tender out for work, they could actually make sure that the companies that they were working with had a DIE themselves. So they would actually put that as part of the tender. That was one of the things that the Local Government Act of 1988 put a stop to. So the Section 28 was perfectly aligned with the intention of the whole act, which was an attack on DIE. The words itself are chilling. Shall not intentionally promote homosexuality or publish material with the intention of promoting homosexuality or promote the teaching in any maintained school of the acceptability of homosexuality as a pretended family relationship. The language is ridiculous and the grammar is pointless. The effect it has was pretty appalling, which we'll obviously go into. But I think one of the points that I want to make is that it's really interesting that what the Tories have done both in this act and also in 1967, when they did the partial decriminalization of the partial decriminalization of homosexuality, they then used the word work being in private. There had been no legal recognition of what the word private meant. So there was masses of arrests trying to work out what private meant. And they did exactly the same thing here. There was no legal definition of the word promote, so nobody knew what it meant.
Wow. Thank you, Sue, for sharing that. And just to continue, where were you during that time? What was happening in your life? Yeah.
Okay. Well, I was doing a lot of supply teaching. I was working in the Fringe Theatre, and I was also teaching some association training courses for lesbians, and also doing some creative writing. So I was doing a mixture of educational work and theatre work.
So did it impact your life in any way at that time, personal and work?
Yes, massively.
Massively.
Thoroughly involved in fighting Section 28, both as an educationalist and also working with the arts lobby, with Ian McKellen and Michael Cashman and Julie Parker and Mavis Seaman. So I was working with both camps, the educational camp and the arts camp.
Okay. And John, where were you at that time, and how did it impact your life? I mean, and I'm talking about both personal and your professional life.
Yeah, so I was the acting head of Lambeth in London Library Services. I'd been there since 1974. I was originally a children's librarian, so my work still in 1988 still involved to some extent working with children and young people, and I was also part of a campaigning group which produced something called the Other Award, which was looking at how we could support, recommend, promote books for children and young people that broke away from the mainstream. In terms of the impact, we'll come back to it in terms of Lambeth and the kind of political impact. But like Sue, it was massive. I was involved in lots of marches and demonstrations. It was a struggle at work, mainly I was in Lambeth from 1974 to 1996. And I never faced any direct hostility or prejudice. There was lots of stuff on the periphery. So I kept going for the senior jobs, for example, and there was some reason which I never got to that I wasn't appointed. There was also a brush that I had with my professional body where somebody complained to them about my behaviour, and so I was kind of investigated by them momentarily. So there was a lot going on, and I think when Section 28 came in, it was also at a time when across London particularly, but also in places like Sheffield and Manchester and Birmingham, there was work going on with libraries, with schools, with education authorities, looking, for example, at portraying positive images of young people. And it was that work, together with the Inner London Education Authority, that I think really riled the government.
Sure, sure. And there was some reference to a book called Jenny Lives with Eric and Martin. Was that the what? Yeah, I remember when researching that. This is interesting. So, yeah, both of you are laughing. So like, why the laughter?
Well, because it was not the most brilliant book in the world,
No.
but it was a very important book in the sense that it was one of the first books to actually attempt to show a gay family. It was not British. It had a whole series of photographs of two guys with their daughter. So it was Jenny and Lives with Eric and Martin, and a series of photographs of their domestic life and make cooking and going shopping, etc. But the one that freaked them all was Jenny in bed with Eric and Martin. Now, I brought up kids, and Saturday morning, Sunday morning, everybody piles in together, and we all have lovely chats and talks. And that was one of those, it's a lovely moment, and when where everybody's comfortable and everybody has chats. That freaked them. Now, the whole point about Jenny Lives with Eric and Martin was it was never in a school, although many, many lies were told that it was. It was in a teacher's education resource centre, which of course no longer exists because the Tories got rid of them, along with in the London Education Authority, which John has just mentioned, which was an incredibly important resource. I mean, the attack that Thatcher did on ILIA and the GLC was just profound. And it was just that vicious attack on the work that was being done to recognise the full diversity of the population. And the fact that, as lesbians and gays, as Black people, as disabled people, as women, we were paying our taxes, but we weren't getting the services that we deserved. So the work that was being done, as John was mentioning, in Manchester and Sheffield and Liverpool and in several boroughs in London, all Labour, of course, were attempting to make that right and actually deliver the services which were linked to other people. I mean, not a lot of money was spent, it has to be said, but there was that attempt. There was that recognition that that work needed to be done. But that tiny little attempt at recognizing the full diversity of the population freaked them. And if you look at the language and if you look at the media, and I think that's the other thing that we have to recognize, that time we had very right-wing press, but we didn't have the alternatives that people have now. So there was no social media, there was no internet, there was not the variety of papers. Those of us who were interested were producing our own newsletters and we were sending those out. But the mainstream media, we only had the BBC and ITV at that point. So it was a very narrow mainstream focus, which was all right-wing and viciously attacking, very racist. I mean, the election pre-1988 was incredibly racist. I mean, there were things like, because one of the homophobic ones was, my name is Betty Sheridan and I will vote Tory because if Labour gets in, they'll turn my kids gay. That's the sort of stuff that was out there. And the politicians picked up lies and told endless lies in the Houses of Commons. Even after it was shown to be lies, they just went on. So, I mean, we talk about fake news now. We were dealing with total lies then.
Wow. And John mentioned that he didn't face any hostility. So did you face any hostility?
No, I'm white, middle class privilege. I used it. I mean, I was out there as a supply teacher. I was always out when I went into staff rooms or classrooms. I mean, I didn't wave my hand and say I'm a lesbian, but it was pretty obvious, short hair. And I think I was driving a car at that stage, not my motorbike, but it was pretty obvious. And I think, people knew. And I was working with schools out at the time. So I think my white middle class privilege very definitely protected me. And so I used it.
Sure. I think in both your cases, can I safely say that, John, in your case as well, a cis white man, no hostility because of that, because the more intersections we have now, which we have recognized, the more hostility and abuse you tend to face, right?
I agree, but there was a strange side effect, which was that my then manager kept saying, "Oh, you couldn't possibly do that, John. You're far too gentle, or you're far too kind," or there were all those kind of euphemisms about being gay that they kept throwing out, that I was too weak to do something, or I wouldn't have the strength or the guts to be. It was kind of like I was kept away from managing anything until I kind of got a different manager who actually challenged all that and said, "You're good at this, do it." And I needed that. So, yeah, it wasn't the kind of being prejudiced against because I'm gay, but there were stereotypes mixed in there that got in the way.
Sure. And John, I think, Sue, it was you who alluded to you talked about promoting homosexuality. So what does that really mean? Like, even in practice? Yeah.
Well, yes. You tell me.
Yes. Yeah. Like when I was researching, sorry, Sue, and I kept on thinking, when they say promoting homosexuality, that's used even now to this day in 2025. And I keep wondering, what do you mean when you say promoting homosexuality? I'd love to know more about it.
Well, I think they deliberately used that word because, as I said, there was no legal knowledge of what it meant. And so it could mean whatever they want it to mean. I mean, the important thing to recognize is during those 15 years that Section 28 was in, we had no prosecutions. So that's very interesting, I think, that whole recognition that it actually did not get to prosecution level at all. So although they used a very euphemistic word, they used it because they knew that people would be scared. And therefore, people would be scared to do anything in case it was promoting. But I think, the irony was, of course, I mean, heterosexuals constantly promote their sexuality. White people constantly promote their existence as white people. Men promote their existence as men. So, but what they were after was obviously trying to shut us up and to say that we didn't have a right to be proud of who we are, which is, of course, one of the reasons why we use the word pride, because the opposite of pride is shame. And we were not going to be ashamed of who we were. We were going to be clear. We were going to be out. We were going to be proud. But of course, a lot of people, a lot of teachers went back into the closet for those 15 years.
Wow. So John, I'm coming back to this. Is like very interesting to understand, Sue. But what were the consequences? So if you promoted homosexuality, or you were seen to be promoting homosexuality, what happened, and who told on you?
That's an equally good question. Quickly just add to what Sue said. I completely agree with her, but I think there's also something where there's and it's back, we've got it again now. There's a kind of myth or horror, something that, I'll take one example. Look, gay men, for example, go around somehow recruiting younger boys to become gay men. And it's, it's completely wrong, and has no logic or sense. But the use of the word promotion, I think, taps into that kind of fear that somehow there's something out there that people like us are doing. And I think that's what we're getting now. So we're getting a lot of that kind of tapping into fear about what LGBTQ plus people are doing, which kind of, then makes people have a snap response. And the snap response is some of what we're seeing right now. Nothing happened. Sue was right. So for me, the biggest thing was not the legislation itself, but the fact that people started running scared and thinking that if they did X, Y, or Z, they might get into trouble. And so they didn't do it. And so if you ask, you may ask me in a minute, but if you ask me to sum up what I thought Section 28 kind of did, it's that it didn't really do anything, but it instilled an enormous sense of fear. And I'll say this now rather than later on, I still meet people who think that Section 28's in force.
Yeah.
And still feel that they can't, in a library setting, for example, put up an exhibition of LGBTQ plus books, or put up a sign that says where their local switchboard is, or whatever it is. So that fear that it instilled in people was the biggest challenge.
Sure, but when we talk about fear, fear has a consequence, right? That's why you fear something, because you believe that something is going to happen to you if you did what, you went against the legislation. So that's what I'm trying to understand. So what was that fear, apart from the fear of, being called, being homophobic? What was that fear? What was if I came out and I said, I think Sue is promoting homosexuality, what would happen to Sue if that was voiced?
I mean, I think if you're working in, Sue and I might answer this slightly differently, because I think it's different in a school, but in a local authority setting like a public library service, the biggest fear was that the local authority would descend on you like a ton of bricks. You'd get disciplined, you might get sacked for disobeying some kind of principle that the local authority was holding. It was very vague. I mean, the whole thing was vague, but the fear of getting into trouble was really the big thing as far as libraries and local authorities were concerned. But I know it's different in schools. So
how was it different?
Well, it would depend on what school you were in. I mean, every school is very much got its own culture, which is very dependent upon the senior management team. So for some teachers, LGBT teachers, would know that their senior management team was highly prejudicial against LGBT people. So they knew that they would be at risk of losing their jobs. Now, while I say nobody got prosecuted, my guess is that some teachers did get sacked. the problem was at that stage that our teachers' unions were not that strong around LGBT issues. It was one of the things that Schools Out had to do. Most of us were members of then the NUT, which is now the NEU. So Paul Patrick, who was my co-chair on Schools Out, and I joined a very early working party with the NUT, now the NEU, to try and strengthen them. But the whole 15 years that it was going, Paul and I had our phone numbers in local press, in gay press, and we would get phone calls at least 2 or 3 times a week from very scared teachers who didn't know what to do, who had been challenged by a parent or been challenged by a teacher and was asking for advice. So I would take them through what the legal situation was. I would suggest that they, what union were they involved in, and get to try and get some support from the union. But basically my job and Paul's was to take them through what the legal situation was and try and give them confidence. But in a school, if you've got a head or if you've got a senior management team which is against you for whatever reason, then you are in a very vulnerable situation, and it's very difficult to hold still and to hold proud, because the atmosphere is so strong and the head and the senior management team have such power. So, as I say, some teachers definitely went straight back into the closet because they knew they weren't safe. Remember, teachers had been sacked prior to Section 28 because they were seen to be lesbian and gay, and it was legal so to do. We didn't have the legislation in place which protected you.
Yeah. So basically now they had the license to basically just sack someone, because of their sexual orientation. That is shocking, really shocking to hear. But it still happens in 2025. I keep reminding myself it still happens now,
Yeah.
So,
but we do have now a lot more support than we had then.
Mm-hmm.
We have got the unions now. We have got, the Equality Act. So we do need to hold on to that. And I think one of the things that we need to be very careful of is to protect the Equality Act of 2010, and also the recognition that we need Europe and the European Court of Human Rights. And I know that part of Farage and part of the extreme right is wanting to get rid of that. And we have got to be really clear that it's crucial that we keep those in place.
So I'll continue with you. So what happened to the youth at that time? Those coming to terms with, all of us are coming to terms with our sexuality. They're young at that time, and then there is this legislation passed. So how did the school deal with this? The teachers?
Well, again, it's different in each school.
Yeah.
It's quite difficult to make a generalization. But to the people that I've spoken to who were in school during the whole of Section 28, basically say, there was nothing. Well, of course, there was nothing when I was at school either. I mean, I'm 78 now. And when I was at school, there was nothing. Part of the reason why I set up LGBT History Month was because, we had been lied to in what was going down in school. So although I was reading and working with LGBT people, they never were outed. So I was lied to by omission. But I think what Section 28 did was to really emphasize that. So I think a lot of teachers were really frightened not to say anything because they were afraid that they would be sacked. So I have heard stories of lesbian and gay people asking him for information and being told, oh, no, I can't talk about that. It's illegal. It wasn't. That was the whole point. It was not illegal. And I think that's something which is really important that I want to get across today. Section 28 was an attempt to attack schools. But in fact, if you read Hansard, they knew at the time that they passed it that it would not affect schools because they had already passed the authority from schools, from local authority to the governors. So technically, it did not affect schools at all. The effect was from the right wing, from the press, and everybody's fear. That's why the whole of the 15 years that it was running, I was out and proud, Paul Patrick was out and proud, other teachers were out and proud, Schools Out ran courses, we had conferences every year, showed resources, we set up a little website with lots of resources on it, and there were teachers who were, for the entire 15 years, teaching LGBT issues. But they were a minority, even though we had attempted to get the word out. And I think there was something similar, wasn't there, John, as far as libraries were concerned?
Yeah. So before, if I do a very quick, so before 1988, things in libraries had been improving very slowly. It's not a massive improvement, but people are often startled by it. When I moved to Lambeth in 1974, it was only shortly after that that libraries were allowed to start buying paperbacks. So libraries hadn't actually stocked paperback books before that because they were considered to be too ephemeral. So to have something where you're not only stocking things that are paperback, but stocking things that might reflect a positive image of a young Black person or an LGBTQ plus person or whatever it is, took a long time to get going. But there was a lot of work going on through the 70s and early 80s up until 1988. In Lambeth, similar to what Sue's just described, Lambeth was part of a group called the Association of London Authorities, which were primarily Labour authorities in London, who got legal opinion. And the legal opinion was that, exactly as Sue's just said, putting up a display or putting out a book list or doing a storytelling that might include an LGBTQ plus book wasn't promotion. Nobody knew what promotion was. It wasn't illegal. So with the legal backing, we actually continued, and Lambeth and other London authorities in particular put on exhibitions, did book lists, all sorts of things happen. But for me, I think one of the saddest things, and it still has an impact, is that I've got friends, most of whom are straight, who grew up in this period. And one of them I know quite well. And I've talked to him in the past about kind of what happened at school. And at his school, during the 15 years when he was at school, nobody mentioned anything to do with LGBTQ plus things at all. And he didn't know about Section 28 either. So he didn't really understand why this whole bit of life was missing from what he was taught. And there must be other young people who'd come through the school system like that. So yes, there are people who are getting information, but sadly there will be quite a lot who won't.
I think the other thing was the fact that a massive amount of homophobic bullying happened in schools.
Yeah.
During that time, because Section 28 legitimized the prejudice and fueled it. So then homophobic kids or ignorant kids or kids just following the footsteps of what was being said and done felt that it was perfectly acceptable to give homophobic bullying. So the amount of homophobic bullying going on in schools was rife. And teachers, A, did not know how to do it, and B, were not sure whether they should challenge it because of Section 28. So we have this incredible legacy of the most appalling amount of horrendousment that kids were going through, which was unchallenged and untapped because nothing positive was being said about LGBT people. So it wasn't being said positively in the press. We weren't getting anything, the culture. I mean, I think one of the things that's really important to recognize is that as LGBT people, we're often very active in the cultural areas, as writers, as people in theatre, as performers, as music. And I think one of the things that I'm so grateful for was there were people in the music world and the theatre world and the writing world who were pushing out stuff and beginning to get people to think differently and challenge the horrendousment that was coming from the right and from the government. And that cultural shift, I think, is incredibly important. You can't make changes just with either laws banning or laws agreeing. You've got to have culture there as well. And I think that during those 15 years, the cultural shift began to make a big difference. I mean, do you agree, John?
Yeah, I think there were queer writers who were continuing to write and continuing to promote their writing, and libraries were stocking a whole wide range of books which they wouldn't have done in the past. And I think all of that has helped to shape some of the background to people who've grown up through that period. So yes, the horrendousness that Sue mentioned was there, and it was probably kind of heightened with the nasty links that were made between particularly being a gay man, and AIDS, HIV. So
Yes.
the whole of that merged into a kind of, people like me were dangerous in every sense. We predated on young boys and we spread germ. It was that kind of, it was a horrible time. I actually gave up reading the papers for a bit just because I couldn't actually cope with the kind of level of vitriol in the newspapers at that period. But as Sue said, like, cultural things began to build and other voices began to get heard, and spoke more and more loudly, which has been great.
Sure.
And I think that recognition that when you get a backlash, when you get attacked, then you gather together and you fight and you push forward. And I think, that some of those cultural things that were happening, like Orange is Not All the Only Fruit, Queer as Folk on television, The First Kiss in EastEnders, all those were beginning to make a difference and to begin to challenge that stuff. And that was coming from a desire to challenge, a desire to say, up with this, we will not put.
Yeah. So whenever something like this happens, there's a lot of resistance as well, right? So we have a movement, people come together, like you said. So was there anything different? Was there a form of resistance that emerged during those years, and where you found some hope and solidarity? Those 15 years is a long time.
It is.
Yeah.
No, I think it's really interesting when you look now. There's a lot of organizations celebrating their 50 years now, and 40 years, and a lot of those organizations formed during those 15 years to challenge what was going down and to support each other. So Schools Out actually started back in 74. Switchboard was been going for 50 years. So in the 70s, there was that recognition that we needed to pull together. But I think during those 15 years, there was that recognition that we could not afford not, in a sense, to work together. And I think that recognition that we had to pull together, we had to work together to make a difference, to make a powerful, positive difference, enthused a lot of organizations. So if you look at, for instance, the LGBT Voluntary Consortium list of all the various charities and groups, and John does this wonderful network, a newsletter, which keeps us up to date with everything that's going down, you can see how many amazing groups did form, did support each other nationally, but also small local groups. And I think that's really important, particularly in rural areas where people can't go up to the big town because the transport is rubbish, so they can't always get to a big city. So those local groups were really important. And the very early beginning of the internet was really important as well. So I mean, we had, as I say, a very early website for Schools Out, where we put, and I think this was something very important, on the first page of the Schools Out website, we said LGBT, and we did have LGBT at that stage, although very early on we were just L and G. Then the B came along, and then the T came along. So it might have been just L and G at that point, because gradually we've been more inclusive. But our intention was to say L and G or LGBT, whatever it was at that stage, people are, and then we did a whole list: Black, white, old, young, Jewish, Gentile, able-bodied, disabled. So we were trying to get people to recognize the vast diversity of our community, because so often what people were seeing when they heard the words lesbian and gay were white men, young white men. So what we were trying to do was to get people to recognize our full diversity, and we didn't have the word intersectionality at that point. So, there we were really pushing the recognition of our full diversity as a community.
So
and I think in libraries there were also all sorts of networks setting up. So people shared good practice, covered each other's backs. We kept when I was in Lambeth, we kept in touch obviously with other London boroughs, but we also kept in touch with places like Birmingham and Sheffield and Liverpool and Manchester, so we could actually share what was happening and keep up with the news and kind of support each other. And a lot of us met up on demonstrations across the UK, where we felt really strongly as people around information that we needed to make our information freely available to everybody. And so there was a lot of not low level, that's not what I want, non-party political but very committed political action going on.
Sure. So, John, are these stories archived somewhere? I mean, a lot of people who were there at that time have been through this very difficult, challenging moments, right? Are there stories archived? Like what we're doing today, we're trying to archive something, we're trying to create something so that people after us can understand what Section 28 was. So, do you have these kind of archives and stories at the library now?
Yeah, sorry, I don't actually work in a library. I work from home in Devon. There are stories, yeah, and sorry, I hate doing this. I've written a couple of books that actually do include some of this information in them, particularly one that looked at LGBTQ plus people and the cultural sector. And I think that I purposely interviewed people with a range of very different voices and have captured quite a lot of those stories. And there has been a lot of archiving of stories from people during that period. But I think we could do with more. I'm not sure that everybody's voice, the full spectrum of voices is captured particularly well.
And Sue, I know that LGBT History Month does a lot of work around this. So, where can we find these stories and
Well,
these?
there's just a brilliant book just popped out called Desi Queers, which
Yeah,
is
yes.
particularly looking at the South Asian situation and the work that was being done in Haringey. And the work that was being done in Haringey was absolutely pivotal. I mean, it was Lambeth and Haringey were really important places. And I think one of the things that is interesting is that Lambeth at that stage had Linda Bellows, am I right?
Yeah.
John? Black out lesbian, and Bernie Grant, who was a black straight guy. But they were both tarred with the word of loony left. And to their shame, the Labour Party at that stage did nothing to challenge that. No. I mean, the Labour Party were incredibly slow to wake up to the need of actually challenging Section 28. And Dr. Jill Spraggs and I have written a very detailed chapter, which is on the LGBT History Month website, which takes you through the entire history of Section 28, where it came from, who was involved at the very beginning, how it then got built. And we copiously use quotes from Hansard, which is where, every word that an MP or a lord speaks is written down. So you can go back and you can look at that. Mm-hmm. And I think, we were very lucky in the sense that we did that just after Section 28 had passed, because I couldn't do that detailed now. I couldn't remember it all. But I think, that is very useful. But there have been also other people who have written about Section 28. So if you put Section 28 into a browser and say, tell me more, I think particularly with AI now, you'll probably get lots. So I think it is out there. But I think we do need, particularly now with the attack on trans people, to be able to look at how did we fight Section 28, what did we do, and what are the lessons learned that we can bring to the situation that we're faced with now.
I agree.
And I grinned when you. So I was going to say, I grinned when you said loony left, because I didn't mention this because it's not really relevant particularly, but it ties in beautifully with that. As part of my job, when I was acting head of libraries in Lambeth, I'd written to a member of the public with a decision that we were not going to buy a book that they'd ordered because, in the view of the selection team, the book was racist. And the member of the public, I still don't know who it was, but the member of the public went to the media about it. And the Sun and the Daily Express and the Times ran all over the story. And the reason I was grinning was that I am loony lefty in library ban.
And be proud of that.
Yes.
So I'm just going to ask you the next question, John, on this. Is so many of us, or many of you, grew up during that time, right? Older members of a community. So how has living through those years shaped who you are today? And do you experience life differently now? I mean, I know these are what and ifs, but do you think it has shaped your life?
Yeah, I think it. Yes, sorry. That's an interesting question. Yes, it has, in several different ways. I think it taught me, possibly particularly, to be wary of alleged friends, So politicians who claim to be going in the same direction, people in the media who, claim to support LGBT people to some degree. But what it really taught me was that I need to look at all those things twice. And I learned to be a lot more critical, but I also learned something about the strength of community that you get when you work with other queer people and you can pull together and do things, and also work with allies. So, some of my really close friends now are straight men who I've known for a long time, and who are real allies and understand what was going on then, and to some extent what's going on now. And I think, it did shape my life.
Excellent. And you, Sue?
Oh, massively. I mean, it taught me so much. I mean, it taught me that up until Section 28, I hadn't really thought about the structures of the state. I had happily marched and yelled and screamed and done all that, been at Greenham, been on marches for Reclaim the Night and supporting abortion and Goddess alone knows what. But I hadn't thought through how can you be effective in making change. So in actually working with the arts lobby particularly, and working with the Lords and getting involved in actually looking how laws were made, that taught me a lot. And also made me recognize I cannot complain. I cannot just march. I have got to come up with solutions, and I've got to find my place in the structures so I can actually affect a change within. So my work from then on has been both outside, challenging and screaming and shouting, but also trying to get inside. I mean, that wonderful song in Hamilton, I Want to Be in the Room Where It Happens, is something that I have wanted to be. So particularly after the Stephen Lawrence inquiry, I was in the room where it happens with the criminal justice system, with training the police, with working with the Crown Prosecution Service to try and make them much better at prosecuting homophobia and hate crime generally. And I'm still in that field in a sense, because I think you can't just complain. You've got to get in there and get your hands dirty. I would never be a full-time politician because I don't think I've got the stamina to do that. But I think as an activist, our job is to both shout from the outside, but also try and get on the inside and try and shape change and offer solutions. What is daunting for me right now is that it feels like so much of the work that I thought we had achieved and the work that I thought the changes that we had made are being massively and very quickly undone. And for my partner, Jean Nadeau, who's an American, what she's watching happening over the pond is even more terrifying, because we're just seeing so much being, I'm saying things undone. I mean, every day something is being undone. And we have got to be so strong here and so clear here that cannot happen. But the effect that Trumpism is having on both commercial companies who think that they've got to bow to it if they're going to sell their products, but worryingly in academia as well. And we've seen the attack on academia that America has done. I've just signed a petition to Harvard saying, hold your ground. We have got to see at least one university saying, no, up with words we will not put, which will hopefully give strength to our academia here. But I think what's so crucial now is we have got to make sure our unions are standing strong and are clear and are supporting the human rights of trans people. And that isn't happening everywhere. And we have got to shore up and challenge our unions and make sure that they are doing that.
And John, do you want to add to that, or do you want to just? I'm now interested in knowing that how was this repealed? Did this happen overnight, or did this happen over a period of time? Were there some people more actively involved? How did it happen? So John, this is to you. Okay, how was this?
Yeah, I'm just sorry. Sorry, I'm getting my brain geared up. I think I completely agree with what Sue said. I think what we need to look at, the thing that scares me, I suppose, if I was looking at that, is how much rubbish there is out there that's actually lying and saying things that patently aren't true. but how little, and I'll talk about libraries specifically for this, how relatively little library people bother with the news or bother with any of that. They're kind of cut off. And so when I talk about these wider things like we're doing this afternoon, yeah, there are some people who get it, but there are also people who feel like that's not their day job. They don't, that's not really what they do. And what I suppose I'd really like to see would be that wider understanding of what's going on across the UK, in the States, and elsewhere in the world. That understanding brought into our everyday lives, whatever we do, and that we don't just get pushed aside or decide it's all too horrendous and we'll just bury ourselves somewhere else, because that doesn't work either. We actually need the challenges and the things that Sue's just mentioned.
Sure. And when was or how was the Section 28 repealed? So
Okay.
what happened? Sue, you want to take that?
Yeah. I mean, Labour, when they came in, did say they would repeal Section 28. I mean, they were very keen.
Okay.
They had woken up by then, and it was in their manifesto. But in fact, it took them a ridiculously long time. And I think there are two reasons for that. One, I think their heart wasn't fully in it. And secondly, the political situation was still not ready for it. So it went, if you look at the whole complexity of how it happened, eventually they had to start. I mean, they tried and it was gotten rid of. The Tories were still strong enough to break it down. I suspect that there were Labour MPs who were also not supporting the challenge. But eventually, and they had to work out how to actually strategically do it. And what they had to do was to start in the Lords and then go back to the Commons, which is really unusual. So it was a really complex change in how to change a law that they eventually had to come up with. So my guess is that there were two things going on. Although they had put it in their manifesto, and we're now seeing things can be in the manifesto with this present Labour government and still not happen, which is infuriating me. That was happening then, but also the Tories were still strong enough to challenge the work that they were attempting to do. So it took them forever. The other thing that is very problematic is we started LGBT History Month because finally it went, but it went with a whimper. Nobody there were no flags raising, there were no fireworks. It was just announced and nobody did anything. So Paul and I, who was my co-chair at Schools Out, we looked at each other and said, well, this is ridiculous. We've got to do something. So we came up with the idea of setting up LGBT History Month. We had Black History Month. People were aware of the concept of having history months. So we thought, well, we'll jump on that bandwagon and we'll have an LGBT History Month. And it was definitely T at that point. When we launched it, there were 13 people on the stage, 3 of whom were trans. And we had people from different ethnicities, from different faiths, able-bodied and disabled people, and a heterosexual ally. So, from the word go, we were trying to make it really clear that we were including the whole community. But we were doing it because Labour were talking about this amazing bill that they were going to bring out, which was going to make sure that no minority was discriminated against. They were going to do a complete, wonderful Equality Act, which was going to tackle all forms of discrimination. They were talking about that in 2003. When did we get it? 2010. And by that stage, they were a dying government. And one of the things that they had in that was to actually tackle economic discrimination. And that was gotten rid of. So,
go on. Sorry.
No, do ask your question.
Now, just saying that during that time, I know when you came and met with us at Tonic Housing, part of your story you mentioned about the abseiling in the Parliament. So the acts, is there something that you'd like to talk about? Please?
Well, that takes us back to when it was being passed. I mean, the process is you go to the Commons, it goes to the Lords, and then it goes back to the Commons. So they had to do it the other way around to repeal it. But when it was being passed, I was sitting in the House of Lords. And in those days, you had galleries where you didn't have the glass, which is all now. And of course, all the security stuff is very much put in place, partially because of the success of this wonderful piece of work. So I was up in the gallery, sitting next to Sheila Hancock, who was a great ally that Ian had brought in, telling me off because I was constantly yelling and being cross. And then I could see opposite me in the other gallery on the other side of the pit. So you're looking down at the House of Lords and there's another gallery there. I'd seen this bunch of lesbians and I'd waved at them and they'd waved at me. They pass it. So it's now going to go to the House of Commons, which is just a, technical thing. So basically we knew that we'd lost and that Section 28 would happen. And I walked out furious, dying for a pee, dying for a fag. And I hear a kerfuffle. So I run back in. And the lesbians who I'd seen on the other side weren't there, and there was this long piece of rope hanging down. And that was when the lesbians had abseiled down into the House of Lords, and I missed the most exciting moment.
Oh, did you miss that? I didn't realize that.
Completely missed it.
What a powerful way to send your message, isn't it? What a powerful and
it was brilliant. I mean, I think the lesbians had done such exciting things. I mean, I think that was one of the things that when you talk to the women who did that, they were saying very clearly that what they wanted to do was to have a control over the news, because we didn't. I mean, everybody was writing crap about us. And the whole point of that action was it gave them a chance to talk about what they felt. And then, of course, the next time when Section 28 finally did get the Queen's assent, they then managed to get themselves into the BBC studio and tie themselves to the news desk that Sue Lawley was talking. And I mean, it's so funny. I mean, Sue Lawley, bless her heart, says, "Oh, it was the most frightening moment of my life." You kind of think, geez, what sort of life have you led? So, the lesbians had done really exciting things. They captured a bus and painted it pink. They dressed up as suffragettes and tied themselves to Buckingham Palace. I mean, there was some wonderful, really creative, challenging activity, very much sort of inspired by the suffragettes. I mean, we really do need to salute to them. And I think one of the things that we need to recognize is, and it's one of the things that I feel very passionate about, is that when suffragettes are being taught in school, nobody mentions that there were Indian suffragettes or disabled suffragettes or lesbian and gay suffragettes. So this year we have LGBT History Month has its theme, activism and social change. And one of the 5 people that we focus is Annie Kenney, a bisexual suffragette who did the most amazing work out there and was, so powerful, so strong, working class, lesbian, bisexual rather, who, was up there doing the most amazing things and really clearly leading the charge for women's vote.
Amazing. This is the best story ever. Seriously. Yeah, best story ever. And we need to hear and listen to these stories, right? And we need to repeat
which is why Lesbian and Gay Bisexual Transgender History Month exists, so that you do hear these stories. So it's so extraordinary that we don't know. So for instance, we've got Octavia Hill, who was one of the 3 people who set up the National Trust. Now, how many people know that a lesbian set up the National Trust?
Yeah.
She also came up with the Green Belt. Ivor Cummings, an amazing black guy who welcomed all the people off the Windrush boat, looked after them, and found places for them in the bomb shelter underneath Clapham Common, which is one of the reasons why Brixton and Lambeth became such a wonderful safety place for African Caribbean people. Who knew? Who knew that Ivan Cummings was there, as a gay man doing that wonderful work? Charlie Kiss, an amazing trans guy who, did the most wonderful things, was there at Greenham, was arrested at Greenham, protesting against the nuclear power on our country, and then went on to be a very vital, important person within the Green Party. Again, trans person hidden. And I think, it's crucial that we get these stories out and enable people to recognize that we've been here, we've been queer, and we've been doing the most amazing things that people take for granted in society and have no clue that, we are there doing all this wonderful work because we're hidden, because we're lied about. We're lied about by omission. And that's why libraries, John, are so important, and the books are so important to enable people to learn that.
Yeah. And I think I completely agree. And I can't top Sue's stories, so I'm not even going to try. But I do think libraries, she's absolutely right. Libraries are part of that whole network of things in society where, I can remember when I was 12-ish, something like that. And I'd go to my library. I knew I was different, I would be, sorry, I'm going to do a quick math now. It would be about 1960. So I knew I was different. There wasn't much in terms of the media that showed anybody that I could be or thought I was or anything. But when I went to the library, there was a range of books that I could find that, yeah, they weren't brilliant, but there were things where I could explore on my own, quietly, without anyone else knowing. So I began to build up something of that history and that background. And it also helped that in the end, I worked in a library, the same library, from when I was about 14. So I was able to then continue that. But for me, and I know for lots of other people, a library is a really basic place in terms of finding out about yourself, interacting with other people. I've got a brilliant friend who's a school librarian, and he keeps telling me about the kids who use his school library
exactly.
in the particularly at lunchtimes, because
Yeah.
lunchtimes are when peak bullying time for lots of kids. And the school library is the place where my friend welcomes every student and makes them feel like they belong somewhere. And I just think that's really strong. And that's kind of what libraries should be doing.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
brilliant, brilliant. I'm going to now go to the last capsule of our conversation, and I want to talk about today's political
Mhm.
climate and the rising hostility, which Sue you've been mentioning. So the EHRC's recent stance on trans rights has caused deep concerns for the in the community, as we know. So do you see parallels between that and the climate leading up to Section 28? Sue, do you want to?
I do see some links, but I think the difference is now. I mean, I was saying to you before that Section 28 didn't legally affect schools, or indeed, as John was saying, legally affect libraries in some ways. But we're dealing with something very different now. We probably could have just about coped with the ridiculous thing of the Human Rights Court. That probably we could have just sailed past that. It wouldn't have been quite such an issue. The problem came when the EHRC came up with that guidance. Now, it wasn't, in fact, to give it the word guidance is not correct. It wasn't even guidance. It was a quick statement that Faulkner put out, which completely misinterpreted what was said in the court, and put the cat amongst the pigeons totally, and made the most extraordinary pronouncements about bathrooms. Goddess, we always talk about bathrooms. It's so ridiculous.
Yeah.
Which was totally and utterly unnecessary. Now, what was the motivation? Clearly, she is gender critical. And clearly, she put that out. And I think what's very obvious is that she then said, oh, we'll do a consultation, but we'll give you 2 weeks. Well, no consultation with the government is ever 2 weeks. That is absolutely ludicrous. So we attacked that. All right, we'll do it in 6. But in fact, when you looked at the actual consultation that she wrote, it was almost impossible to say what we wanted to say because of the way they wrote it.
Yeah.
And that was outrageous as well. But previous to that, we had also had the Conservative government put out a piece of the consultation on guidance, which was a consultation on guidance on gender questioning students. Goddess, what a phrase, which again was a vicious piece of attempt to get gender questioning as a part of the language instead of trans, and was absolutely inviting teachers to be bullies and to ignore the existence of trans people. But it was a consultation on guidance. Unfortunately, schools read that and immediately jumped in and started putting some of those concepts into their schools, totally and utterly unnecessarily, totally inappropriately. Now, why? Because they were gender questioning themselves, or because they were frightened, or felt, oh, we'll just pick this up and do it. Goddess alone knows. But it was totally and utterly inappropriate and should not have happened. So now we've got this weird statement that the ECHR have put out. We've got a consultation, which we all piled in on, and we're hearing very interesting stories about how they're not dealing with all the questions and using AI to actually go through it, which will be highly problematic. We've now got Faulkner, who was the chair, will be resigning in September. The new chair Pamela Stevenson, who 2 committees interviewed and said she is not competent, she's not appropriate. Helena Kennedy, no less, the leading barrister, also said this is not a good appointment. So the government have appointed her against all this advice, and it's very clear that she is gender critical as well. So we have now got a very problematic situation where we have a Labour government not following through on their mandate that they said they would do, and clearly reinforcing some very serious gender critical concepts, as well as the gas report, which again was constantly attacked, and by the BMA itself said this was not medically up to scratch. And then Wes Streeting, a gay man, which makes it even more painful, utilizing it. We've got kids already having to wait 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 years before they've even seen by a consultant to discuss their gender dysphoria. And then now puberty blockers being disenabled. So we've got this vicious attack from our governments beforehand and now our present government. So we are really having to face challenging, severe legal situations. But we're also having to recognize that some of the situations that people think are legal are not. So we're having to constantly remind people, no, you don't have to do anything yet. We have to wait until the guidance really comes out, which I'm afraid, will not be brilliant. And we have to wait for the ECHR statement. But I suspect neither we will like, but we don't have to jump now. But we do have to do an amazing amount of work to challenge what's coming and to make sure that the government hears very clearly that we are not comfortable with it. My guess is we will have to eventually go to the European Court of Human Rights, where I am confident we will win. However, that will then feed the right in saying, look, they've overturned our laws, it's even more reason for us to pull out. That, I think, is one of the motivations of this whole thing, that the trans people are a pawn in this whole process of the right wanting to us to get out of the European Court of Human Rights.
Wow. John, you want to add to this?
I'll add a quick personal comment, and then I'll add something else. So my personal comment is I was one of the individuals who responded to the EHRC consultation. I've never known a consultation where you do a response and then you don't get a copy of your response back, but they haven't kept them or sent them. They tell me that, I don't know, it was some nonsense thing about I hadn't given them permission to use my email address, so they couldn't actually recognise me and couldn't send me my comments back again. Which in itself seems to me unacceptable and not a good way to run a consultation, in addition to all the things that Sue has quite rightly argued there. I think for me, it's feeding into, the media, the stranglehold that the right has on some parts of the media, the kind of stories that we're hearing, the way that social media and some parts of the press, for example, are piling in on organisations, individuals. So I do a lot of work around libraries of sanctuary, working with City of Sanctuary, looking at how libraries can support new arrivals to the UK. And I had a meeting with them yesterday where they were saying that the far right is now targeting City of Sanctuary and the work they're doing, and actually even a face-to-face event turned up and it intimidated one of their team who was actually speaking at the event. And it seems to me this is all part of the same attack on people who are different, people's freedoms. And Sue's absolutely right. There's a huge amount of work to do. And we need more and more people to be involved in it and to understand, what you see on X or wherever it is you see it, isn't the truth. There's a lot more to all these stories, and we need to have the media, like the Guardian does these kind of rather wishy-washy things. It needs to have a lot more teeth in terms of looking at what it's criticising and what it's commenting on. There is a huge amount we need to be doing.
I agree with you, John, that there is a huge amount of work to be done. So, is there anything we can do to equip communities, especially educators, parents, allies, to challenge fear based narratives and support queer and trans youth today?
Well, John was saying, we need a media that has got teeth. I would recommend that people follow a journalist called Ian Dunt, D-U-N-T. He does work in Substack. He's also in the paper I. His articles are pithy, strong, and powerful, and his way of unpicking what's going down is powerful. He is, I think, a lefty. He would love to be able to support Starmer. But he's getting it, like all of us, I think, more and more frustrated with how Labour are not doing the stuff that needs to be done. But he's also saying, as I feel, that they are doing some brilliant work, but are not enabling us to know about it. So their comms are crap. And there's a lot, that needs to be done. But his analysis of the trans situation, of the situation of how the media are feeding this fear of migrants, of asylum seekers, of trans people, it builds up this whole attack of white supremacists. And what we're dealing with is people who are scared of people who are different from white, heterosexual. I think now, I would have said in the past, probably middle class men. And I think it's both middle class and now working class men. So I think, if we look at the people who were doing the rioting last summer, a lot of those people, not all, but a lot of them had very, were people who had been involved in domestic violence, who were people who had a history in actually, this wasn't the first time they were out there attacking people who were different to them. And I think, we as educators, both in schools and in libraries, our job is to do that education, is to give that information about people and enable people to understand we're all the same, and I think that what is being fed, of course, is that we're not all the same, that there are people who are less than, and we have to challenge that. And I think, for me, I suppose one of the things that is so upsetting is that we've been doing that work for 50 years, and this incredible right-wing backlash has come. And as my partner Gina Doe has said, Sue, you've been working with a teaspoon, they've been working with a bulldozer. And the amount of resources that they have behind them is terrifying. The amount of money that's there that can go from the States through to Africa, through to Russia, through to Hungary. All the right wing have linked up. They've been working on the long term. They've been biding their time. And what we're seeing Trump do now is not something that he's just dreamed up, or the people behind him. Let's face it, it isn't Trump. It's the people behind him that have been doing it. Had this plan. They knew what they were going to do. And I think the problem with the left is that we haven't had a plan that's been so clear to actually hold the line. And it's time that we learn to think, how do we hold the line? How do we do the education? How do we communicate to each other the successes that we have? I mean, one of the things that I would constantly say to the police when I was working with them, we don't hear your successes. We don't hear when you've prosecuted a hate crime perpetrator. So no wonder people don't feel confident in reporting hate crime, because they don't know, the successes that you've had, that you can do that. So that whole process, it seems to me, is so much about communication. And because the communication is held by the right wing so powerfully, I mean, most of our mainstream is very right wing, we don't get to hear the stories that we need to hear. So people then go onto the internet, they go onto other areas, and then of course they could so easily get sucked down a rabbit hole of horrendousness. So we need to teach critical thinking. We need to enable our people to discover where they can find the good stuff, and to also then, as John so rightly said, check and check again.
And come together, right? Our community needs to come together. That's the other thing that I sometimes often actually see, stratification within our own LGBTQ community. For something like what you're saying, for something like this, we need this solidarity amongst us so that we can fight this together. And John, do you want to add to that? Because I just wanted to ask you, what gives you hope right now as we progress into 2026? And where do you see resistance growing, and how can we support it?
I think, yeah, sorry, following on from what Sue said, I think the other thing that I find frightening is how unchallenged some of the things that we've known about for ages, but I think people have just said, oh, that's a sort of right-wing theory, we won't bother with that. So things about the Great Replacement and all the stuff that's coming out from the right-wing media, on social media, politicians, politicians here all the time now in certain parties, talking about are being flooded with people coming from abroad, of flooded with people who are different, and they're replacing us. I was doing my emails and looking at things this morning, and I saw it was a brilliant but depressing interview by a journalist who'd been looking at some of the people, or talking to some of the people who'd been at one of the latest attacks on a hostel for refugees and asylum seekers in Bristol. There was.
Yeah, I just read that too.
Yeah, and what they were saying was all that garbage. That we're being swamped. There are all these people coming. They're taking away our rights. We don't have any. What we need are some louder, clearer voices saying this is rubbish. There is no replacement. It's not. But Sue's completely right. The combination of huge amounts of money, an international link up of people across the world who have particular right wing, possibly religious in some quarters views, that needs to be challenged. And I think that's one of our big pieces of work to do. What makes me hopeful is that there are people interested in starting to talk and continuing to talk and trying to do things. And we've got demonstrations that, I'll go back to my other theme. At the Bristol hotel demonstration, there was a huge opposition of people who are pro-refugee, pro-people arriving. And we have those kind of groups supporting the community, working with people in the community, and we need to see ways that we can draw those voices together and have them heard more, because they're not voices you hear on the news very often.
True. And Sue, what gives you hope?
I mean, we've just had a wonderful Pride in Margate. And I think one of the things about the rural prides that aren't in London or Manchester or Sheffield, I think that movement, I think, is incredibly strong. So back in the day, people would go to the big towns and go on a Pride and be anonymous. So they would hope that the television cameras wouldn't catch them and that their parents and family wouldn't know. Now we've got people having their prides in their hometown. So Margate is a small place, but we have it, and the community love it. Deal, Herne Bay, Folkestone, all of around those places. If we go up in the rest of the country, small towns are having their own prides, which means that people are feeling more confident to be out and proud in their community and to challenge the homophobia and general prejudice. And I think when we do prides, we see not only being clear about wanting to support LGBT people, but wanting to support travelers, wanting to support Palestine. There is a recognition that if one person isn't free, then we're all not free. And then I think that's one of the things about the LGBT community. If we think back to the wonderful support that was given to the miners during the miners' strike, was incredibly important in actually moving forward the union's base generally in waking up to the need to actually do more work around LGBT issues, because suddenly the GMB thought, oh goddess, LGBT people supporting us miners, well, gosh, why? And we began to explain it, and then they recognized, oh, we better support you then, and they did. The other thing I think is we look at the youth. The youth today are doing amazing things. The young trans people out there demonstrating, climbing up walls, doing the most wonderful stuff. Climate people getting out there and challenging that. I mean, we haven't touched on the fact that we may not have a planet to be safe on soon. and the work that's being done to try and wake up the governments around that is crucial. I mean, if you think about it, where do we put our energy? Tackling misogynism, tackling climate, tackling, the fact of the horrendous wars that are going on. I mean, there is so much work to be done. And I think what we need to do is be aware of what we need to do and stretch out and make connections with the other groups so that we're all working together to challenge the hideous patriarchy, which is going down at the moment.
Sure. So just before we conclude, I want to just know from you, Sue, and from you, John, what is it that one thing that someone and a younger person can action today and be part of this, what I call a movement? So do you want to take that?
Okay. The wonderful thing that we have now is the fact that you can go online and you can find a local group to join and do that. Find where your allies are, find where the groups are that you can link up with. And it's much easier now than it used to be to actually do that. And there are safe spaces that you go on. I was mentioning the LGBT Consortium have a long list. Proud Trust, have a long list. Stonewall, they will have a link as well. Use the wonderful, things that are around there. Get knowledgeable. Use LGBT History Month. Discover your history. Share it with people, but always make allies. Do not think that you've got to do it on your own. Always link up. Always do the networking. You meet somebody, you talk to them. You never know where they're going to turn up next and be perhaps in a position of power that can then help you and pull you up later. Always network. Always make links with other people. That's a really powerful and important thing to do, I think. But make sure that you're not on your own. Make those links, and there's so many ways to find the safe places to make those links.
Brilliant, Sue. And you, John?
Yeah, you'd think Sue and I'd rehearsed this, because I'm going to follow on exactly with that, about networking. It's probably not a good thing, really, to say about one library service that's brilliant, but I kind of want to, because they're small. What they're doing is small but huge. So Norfolk Library Service has an LGBTQ plus history club that meets regularly once a month. They have a reading group. They do all sorts of activities. They go to places. They go to Pride events. Went down to London to see some events that were on. I just think that's a great way of networking, and it's being encouraged and supported by all the library staff in the Millennium Library in Norwich, a whole team across the library service. They invited me to go to one of their sessions a little while ago, and I went, and it was absolutely amazing. There was he would have been 12-ish young man there, with his mum, and his mum had brought him and was 100% supportive of what he was doing or what they were doing, and he joined in. They had a zine making afternoon, and he was just creating these brilliant things, but also talking to all sorts of other young people. They were up, I think it was up to about 24, 25. So a huge range of ages for young people, but they were all sharing very positive things that they wanted to do and could do, and being themselves and not having to hide whatever they thought they were. And I if that model could be replicated across the country, that would be brilliant.
One of the things that they've done is to make this wonderful film which teaches people how to queer museums and libraries. So it's available to look at. And I mean, it's stunning. It's from young people to actually do that with the support of the librarians, showing adults how to do the job. Perfect.
Brilliant. All these interesting, resources that you have talked about, we will just compile them, put them up on the YouTube channel so that people can refer to them later as well. So with this, we are going to conclude our fantastic session. Wow, it's so rich. And I felt like I was sitting in front of supercomputers, both of you. Like, look at the knowledge you have. And this is why I've known Sue for a while, and we just absolutely adore Sue. And I want to thank you also, Sue, for sharing some of my LinkedIn posts. And I know because little, everything just comes together and we all count. And if each one of us can do that one bit, and for me personally, I encourage the younger generation to use social media in the most effective way possible because it has the maximum reach now. And people who are known in the community, activist influencers, we have a huge responsibility to ensure that we, pass this on to the next generation, and the next generation is equipped to handle anything, whether, and I don't think I hope that nothing will ever happen like Section 28 again in our lives. But for that, we all have to fight the fight together.
Yeah.
So thank you
Exactly.
both. Thank you, Professor Sue Sanders and John Vincent. Really, I learned so much today, and I'm sure our listeners are going to be very excited about the richness of this conversation. And thank you both for sharing your experiences and insights with our listeners today. And to our listeners, if you have any comment, feedback, or questions, please write to us at theviewsroom@gmail.com. And let me thank our outreach partners as well: My G Work, Proud HR, Outspoken Speakers, Ageism is Never in Style. And thank you to the Views Room for producing this. Please continue to share Older Queer Voices podcast widely. You will find us also on Spotify and Apple. Just search for the Views Room. Thank you, and see you all at the next episode. Thanks, Sue and John.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.